Hi, and welcome to the Becoming Trauma-Informed podcast, where we help you understand how your past painful experiences are affecting your current reality and how you can shift those so you can create your desired future. I'm Dr. Lee, and both myself and our team at the Institute for Trauma and Psychological Safety are excited to support you on your journey. We talk about all the things on this podcast. No topic gets left uncovered. So, extending a content warning to you before we get started. If you notice yourself getting activated while listening, invitation to take care of yourself and to pause, skip ahead a bit, or just check out another episode. Let's dive in. Hey y'all, what's up? Welcome. How are you? I'm gonna just give it a second. If you're watching on the replay, #replay. If you're watching live, say hi so I can say hi back, please, and thank you. For our podcast listeners, hello. This Live with Lee is about trauma and grief. And I've been hesitating on this one because this is one that I've actually had several people ask for, and I don't know why, but I just hesitated on it. And I now know why I hesitated on it. I feel like everything always happens for a reason. And I've learned for myself that when I try to force teaching something that I truly feel like I'm not ready to teach yet, it doesn't go well. So this was me honoring my intuition and my own timing and going, okay, I had to move through some of my own things and experience some of my own grief moments in order to be able to teach on this. So I'm actually really excited because we're going to be bringing a grief module into our trauma-informed, psychologically safe certification program that starts on January 17th. And we're going to go even deeper than we're going today. So if you enjoy this conversation here, then definitely think about joining trips because we're going to go even deeper. All the conversations, all the lives I do, all the podcast episodes, if you enjoy them, you probably want to get into trips with us because we talk about the stuff even more. So when we think about grief, first of all, I just want to container this. As always, our lives and our teachings can feel a little bit activating. And so just a reminder to show yourself some grace if you're listening to this, so show yourself some compassion and attunement, another big thing we teach on, allowing yourself to be in the moment and be however you are, feel however you feel. And if it gets to feel like it's too much or it's too distressing, invitation to pause or to come back or to do some grounding exercises or whatever you need to do, whatever feels best for you. So here's the first thing that I want to say about grief. It's something that, like, when I say it, you're going to be like, well, yeah. And also, although we accept that this is truth in theory, in practice, we treat grief differently. So the first thing I want to say about grief is this. Grief, in its essence, is physiological, not pathological. And what I mean by that is grief is a healthy part of the human process. Grief is a necessary part of being a human. It is not, in most cases, pathological, meaning it's not something that is a or like causes disorder or is a dis-ease. Okay. There are grief disorders. There are times at which our grief can become less of a process to help us move through something and more of a place that we get stuck or something that causes significant distress and can cause harm. And for the most part, a lot of us are afraid of grief. And that is because we have been socialized in a lot of scenarios to be afraid of grief. We've been taught that grief is pathological, not necessarily outright, but it's been modeled for us that grief is pathological. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's a couple ways that we have really taken the process of grief and changed it so that it can feel more pathological for us. It can feel wrong or bad for us to go through the grieving process, as opposed to it being like a healthy part of our experience as humans. And so the first thing is that for many of us, we have been socialized that outwardly showing emotion or getting very upset about something is wrong. Okay. So we were actually having this conversation as a family. The adults were having this conversation over Christmas. And I don't know if many people know this, but there's like 15 college degrees when my family gets together at the dinner table. So like a lot of times the conversation goes very intellectual. And so we were having this conversation around our mortality rates, infant mortality rates, and around life expectancy. And so a lot of people don't know this. And I don't have exact figures or dates or anything like that. I didn't look this up beforehand, but a lot of people don't know that the reason that our life expectancy has increased so much over the last few centuries is because infant mortality has drastically declined. And why am I talking about this here? The reason I'm talking about this here is because up until a few centuries ago, death and dying and illness and loss and uncertainty were so much more a part of our daily lives, right? As a parent, it was not rare for you to lose a child. As a sibling, it was not rare for you to lose a sibling when they were younger. In fact, sometimes we didn't even name our children until they were a year or two old. We just called them the baby, which is why we say the baby now, because the baby didn't have a name because we waited. And I know that's kind of like a morbid thing to bring up here. And you're probably like, why on earth were you talking about this at Christmas? And I actually can't remember how exactly we got on the topic, but it was really valuable because what we were talking about was the fact that as a society, a lot of times we have stopped centering the full human experience around life and death. One of the things that we do is we have stopped talking about death as a natural part of the process. And our goal as humans is to extend life as long as possible, right? And this is something I used to see in healthcare a lot. You know, the focus is on the amount of life, not the quality of life necessarily. And so just thinking about that in relation to grief, if we have stopped looking at death and dying as a natural part of the process, that also means that a lot of times we stopped looking at grief as a natural part of the process, right? People understood, oh, I get to grieve this thing that's happened because it's a normal, quote unquote, normal thing that's happened, right? So understanding that the likelihood that you would lose a loved one was higher, and the likelihood that you would have to go through grief was higher. And we've kind of been socialized out of that. So that's the first piece. The other piece is that several years ago, a physician by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she published something called the 5 stages of grief around death and dying. And what we did collectively as a society is we took these 5 stages of grief that Dr. Kubler-Ross meant specifically around finding out that you or someone you loved was dying. And we applied those 5 stages of grief to all kinds of grief. And we basically said, this is how people grieve any loss, any major loss. And while it's helpful to have a schematic, it's helpful to have an understanding of how people typically grieve. You know, if you've heard of these 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. When you think about the fact that those were only studied around people who were either dying themselves or who had a loved one who were dying, they make so much more sense, right? Because I like to think about the bargaining stage, right? Well, who would I bargain with if I've already lost something? How could I bargain if somebody has already died? Who could I bargain with, right? So these 5 stages of grief are happening when you know that a major loss is coming of something or someone that you love. That is when these stages make the most sense. The other piece is when we look at the 5 stages of grief, they leave out a key 6th stage. And without this 6th stage, some people still get stuck. And the 6th stage is meaning. So the 6th stage is, what did I learn from this? What does this mean moving forward? And so a lot of people accept that grief or that loss has happened. A lot of people accept that someone has died. They have lost something that's majorly important to them or someone that's majorly important to them. And they don't ascribe meaning to it, right? When you meet people who have gone through a true process of grief, which we're going to talk about how we do that in just a second. When you meet people who have truly gone through the process of grief and have come out on the other side and have integrated the meaning of that grief into their lives, you can tell there's a fundamental difference between how that person talks about the experience that they've been through and how someone else talks about that experience that they've been through. It's the difference of, well, it is what it is. I can't change it. And, oh, this is why that happened. And another way that we pathologize grief, by the way, is what I am saying around finding the meaning in things. What I don't mean is that we love and light our way out of the situation or that we spiritually bypass the grief. Okay. Because this is what a lot of people do. A lot of people have something happen to them that is fully deserving of a grief process. And they say, oh, well, everything happens for a reason. So, this happened for a reason. And or somebody will say that to you, well, everything happens for a reason. So that is truncating, that is cutting off the very necessary integration of the experience. That is cutting off the necessity to feel the emotions that you have, to go through the process of figuring out what the heck it means, what the heck you're going to take from what just happened to you. So these 5 stages of grief, one only meant for dying, right? You yourself or someone else that you love in the active process of dying, not studied around other forms of grief. And the other piece here is that there are lots of other major areas of grief that oftentimes we end up invalidating ourselves around because they don't feel as serious as someone dying or being really injured. Okay. So some of the other forms of places that you can experience grief. One is the loss of your livelihood, right? The loss of the financial and structural security and safety that you have, the certainty that you had around what you were doing with your life, why you were doing that with your life, who you were doing that with in terms of coworkers or companies, and feeling the sudden loss or change of that. Okay, that's number one. Number two is the loss of a pet. A lot of people, we lost our dog, Georgia, our first puppy. My husband and I that we had together, our first fur baby, she was 12 years old and we lost her. And that's how it felt. It felt like a loss, right? We were able to say goodbye to her. She had cancer. We were able to keep her comfortable. We were able to have a few really good weeks with her before she passed away. And no one prepared me for the level of grief that I was going to feel around losing that dog. No one also prepared me for the level of grief that my children were going to feel and what was necessary for me to be able to support them through their grieving process while also grieving myself. And that's something that we don't talk about as parents. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in this. One of the key things that we did was show our kids attunement. And basically, they were allowed to have feelings for as long as they needed to have feelings, and that was okay. One of our kiddos would just look outside of the window because we buried her outside in this nice little enclosure. And our kiddo would just look out the window and talk to her and say prayers. And that was what felt best for her in order to be able to process. And that was really hard for us as parents to watch her at the window crying, talking to the dog out loud. And also that was the process that they needed in order to be able to grieve. Another one is a major move, right? A major physical move or a major energetic move. So for me, there was grief in leaving clinical practice and leaving the bedside and leaving academia and starting my own business. There was so much growth in that. And there was a lot of grief too. One of my favorite sayings from a coach that I've worked with, Sarah Chiswick, is she says, there is so much grief in growth, right? So sometimes these aren't even losses. Sometimes it's oh, I'm moving away from my childhood home, or I'm moving across the country for this really, really great opportunity. And also I'm leaving friends behind, and I'm leaving a community that I've created here. And it's not that none of us exist anymore. It's not that I'm really losing anyone. And yet there is a change. If you've watched our boundaries module or listened to our podcast on boundaries, we talk about like your plots of land and who you decide your plots of land are closest to. And when the plot, your figurative plot of land like literally moves, right? You're physically more distant from someone. There's grief in that if you've grown accustomed to having that person close to you. Another one is like a change in relationship. So maybe it's a divorce, or maybe it's a marriage. One of the things that I think a lot of us, we don't talk about is if you've lived on your own for a while and you have things the way that you like them, and you have a system, and you have a way that you organize and all of these things, and you join your life with someone else's, and they have different ways of doing things, there can be some grief around that. Again, grief and growth. We're growing together as a couple. And also I get to kind of mourn the loss of independence in some ways, or mourn the loss of like only having to think about myself. Parenthood is another example of this. There is grief in becoming a parent. There is grief in recognizing that you are responsible for the outcome of another human being for the rest of your life, right? There is grief in that. And it's one of those conversations that I feel like we don't have. One of the things that I really realized is that I love my children. I love my children more than anything else in the entire world. I would take a bullet for them. I would suffer immeasurably for them to be okay. And also sometimes do I have the thought of like, man, I could have been really good as like a dual income, no kids household. Yes, that thought comes up for me sometimes, especially when things get hard. Does that mean I love my kids any less? No. And is there grief in the fact that in this one life, I'm not going to get to experience that? I've never lived alone. I've never been fully independent like that. I've always had a roommate or a boyfriend or a fiance or a husband or a family. Yes, there's grief in that, and that's okay. But making ourselves wrong for experiencing that grief or invalidating ourselves because society invalidates us around that, that's definitely something that we want to look at. And then the last thing is, and I think this kind of relates to what I just talked about here, is the loss of possibility, right? The realization that something's never going to happen, that maybe you dreamed about having it happen, or it's never going to happen the way that you thought it would. So maybe you realize that, oh, I wanted to have my kids grown and out of the house by age 50, and I'm 45 and I'm having my first child. Or, I've always wanted to, I think of a story that a close person told me around, I always wanted to be a pilot. And then finding out that I didn't have the vision, good enough vision necessary to be a pilot, like that, like really dashed my dream. And there was grief in that, right? I've experienced grief in several positions in my life, and like, oh, this is how I thought things were going to go. This is what I dreamed of, and this is not it. The other thing is that my husband and I wanted 4+ kids. And after the second pregnancy, when my body was like, no, and I had health problem after health problem after health problem, and then our son had health problems, and it was just so hard. The grief there was like, okay, we have to decide that our family is going to look different than what we planned on, because me having another child, I remember when the doctor said to us, here's the thing, is you have a 10% likelihood of having twins again, because we have a set of twins. And he said, I know that you guys really want to have more kids and don't want to prevent yourselves from having more kids. And also the likelihood that your husband could end up with 4 kids without a mom is a real possibility, instead of 3 kids who have a mom who's here. And that was, I remember, like, that was such a hard thing to hear. Such a hard thing to hear of like, this really might not be a safe option for you. And so you really need to consider that moving forward. So all of those things bring grief, and trying to go through these and apply these traditional stages of denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance, like putting ourselves into that box. And also at the same time, when we think about grief, since our society has said, hey, we don't like to talk about death and dying. Hey, we don't like to look at this natural process of life and order and what it means to be a human on this planet. Since we traditionally don't really accept that, and it's not something that we like to talk about, it's not like something that we like to consider will happen to us at one day, it is hard for us to also validate our own grief. And it is hard for us to put ourselves in proximity with other people who are grieving. Because when we put ourselves in proximity with other people who are grieving, it reminds us that bad things can and will happen to us as well. That things that lead to grief will happen to us as well. And honestly, I think for me, the reason that I ended up in bone marrow transplant and inpatient hematology and critical care and all of these places, it was actually helpful for me as someone who has a fear of death. And I would say that that fear is much, much less than it used to be. But as someone who had a fear of death for a very long time, like when lay awake at night and think about it, which by the way, this is one of the biggest fears that humans have, is a fear of death. Number one fear, which is so fascinating, right? As someone who had that fear, what I did was I got myself really close to it. It helped me to put myself close to it and see it on a consistent basis, because it reminded me that it was a normal part of life. And it reminded me that while we have some control over it, we don't have that much control over it. I just share that because I think a lot of people are like, how can you get into spaces like that where you're surrounded by grief all the time? And one of the things is like, it normalizes it for you. It validates it for you. It makes it make sense that when you have grief, that you're like, oh, this actually makes sense because I know what grief is, and I've been around grief, and I know that grief is normal. So I want to talk about how you move through grief, how we move through grief. First of all, again, just kind of based off of what we've already talked about in here, there are a lot of cultural differences around this. I remember when I brought my then boyfriend, now husband, to my great aunt, her funeral here in Columbus, Ohio. I brought him to that funeral, and my husband is a white man who was raised by Lutheran and Catholic parents. And so he had never been to a Black funeral. And I remember us going in and him walking out and being like, that was awesome and weird, right? Because that funeral was, people were singing and laughing and dancing and crying at the same time. And there was it was more of a celebration of this person's life while we were also very sad. It was both at the same time. And my husband had never seen that. My husband had never seen people simultaneously experiencing joy that this person was coming home, right? And also grief and sadness and anguish that person was no longer here with us. So there are cultural differences in how we approach grief, right? Some forms of grief are allowed to exist. If you had seen that scenario in a most white Protestant churches, like you would have been like this, a lot of people would have been very uncomfortable, right? This isn't how you show grief. But in that Black Baptist church, that made sense. That was how we showed grief. Same thing at, my grandfather being buried at Arlington. That ceremony was very different. That ceremony was very solemn and practiced. That was a cultural difference. That was the military way. So there are cultural differences. There are sociological differences of like where you live. And again, those are kind of cultural, but also come into just in general, how a country or how a nation does things versus how a ethnicity or race or religious background or spiritual background or whatever do things. Okay. So there's cultural differences. There's geographical differences. There's also gender differences. I was reading this study around how men have been socialized to grieve, and also genetically, evolutionarily, men have evolved from a grief perspective. And most people have seen this probably. And again, these are generalizations. These aren't, every single person is going to have a different way of grieving that makes sense for them. And generally, men are more likely to grieve through action. They grieve through action. So what they do is, and this is what we also think of like as the more traditionally masculine way of grieving, is I'm going to do something with my grief. I'm going to channel it into something. And honestly, from a trauma response perspective, this can also be more of like the fight or flight response. So this is, I'm sympathetically activated and I am going to go into like driving this energy, this discomfort, this distress into something. So women tend to be more demonstrative emotionally around their grief, and men tend to be more demonstrative physically around their grief. So men are more likely to channel, and women are more likely to have an expression of their grief from an emotional perspective. Now, like I said, those are generalizations. And it's just important to know that there is no one right way to grieve. One of my mentors, Dr. Eric Gentry, he talks about, and he said this, and this statement is something that I've repeated to so many clients who are grieving. There's a 1-year rule before we can even consider grief pathological, okay? And the 1-year rule is this. In general, if somebody is still grieving up to 1 year after something has happened and they are not actively hurting or harming themselves or someone else, that is considered physiological grief. That is considered normal. It is considered part of the grieving process. So here's an example of this. If somebody is sleeping 16 hours a day, someone gets up, goes to work, eats a meal, comes home, gets back in bed. For a lot of us, we'd be like, oh my gosh, we don't, that's not okay. That's not normal. They need to be out. They need to be doing things. They need to be interacting with people. Maybe not. If they are not hurting or harming themselves, if they are ensuring that the people that they are responsible for are taken care of, and they are not actively harming themselves, then having trouble moving, being sad, experiencing feelings of depression, or a desire to not do anything, anhedonia, like not having pleasure in most things, that's situational, that is physiological, that is normal. And you hear that year mark and you're like, really? A year? Yeah. Yeah. And here's my take on this. Okay. This is not based in research. So I'm going to just say this right. This is a hypothesis that I have that has not been tested. Okay. I don't actually think that it's the first year, it's the year, like it's a year after the thing happens. I think that it's a year after you step out of survival mode and things are handled. What do I mean by that? So for me, the way that I deal with loss, nevers, right? The loss of possibility, the loss of something that I had already, the loss of a person in my life, is I handle it first. What needs done, right? So how can I help? What can I do? What do you need? It's probably why I was really good at my job when I was in clinical practice, why I responded to emergencies, because from a grieving perspective, I went more into that masculine, what can I do? How can I help? How can I handle this? How can I make sure everyone's taken care of? Which is a response to grief in itself. But that was survival mode. I need to make sure that everyone else is good. I need to make sure that I'm good. I don't feel safe right now. So it wasn't until the situations were over, right? Until that person was buried, until everything had been handled, until everything was taken care of, that I would all of a sudden have an utter just breakdown emotionally, physically. That, I think, is where we start the clock on that year. because what we know is that survival trumps healing. Keep that sentence in your brain. Survival trumps healing. So until you feel safe, until you feel like whatever has happened and is done and you are safe again, you can't get into that grieving process. And this is why sometimes people will have something happen 25 years ago, and then maybe the person who caused that pain dies, or the situation that caused that loss, it changes. And all of a sudden, all of the grief is there. And it's time for you to go through that process. And the reason behind that is because your nervous system finally feels safe. So one of our goals, especially if you are somebody who is in a situation where you work with a lot of people who are coming to you in a state of loss, is to create safety for them. And honestly, I think that this is why so many people in our TRIPS program ended up going through their own grieving processes, which they've shared in testimonials. And they're like, that was hard. And also it was like, I finally had this safe space to work through all of that and to feel accepted and loved and like I belonged while I looked at all of those things. This is a lot of my clients when we're doing one-on-one work and they're like, 2 or 3 months in and they're like, okay, hold on a second. I just need to sit. Like I am having the urge to just sit still. I don't want to do anything. I'm feeling like I'm having all these feelings coming up and these emotions. And I'm like, that's because we've created safety in your nervous system for you to actually feel all of these things that you haven't been feeling. I teach a lot on polyvagal theory with Dr. Stephen Porges, and that's his theory. And we talk about it a lot in TRIPS as well. The thing about our nervous system is that it's divided into when we look at our vagal nerve and our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system, we used to just think about it in 2 parts. We thought about like rest and digest, our parasympathetic, and fight or flight, our sympathetic nervous system. And what we found is that parasympathetic nervous system really has 2 parts to it. It has 2 places that it neuronally connects in our brain, our vagus nerve into our brain. And the ventral connection is what is activated when we feel psychologically and physically safe. It's about connection. It's about love. It's about feeling seen and heard and understood. And that part of our brain is really where grief happens. Because grief happens due to the loss of connection and love and belonging and what we thought life was. So in order for that part of our brain to be active, our body has to feel safe. Because if not, one of these other 2 parts of the nervous system are activated more than the others, are dominant. We have the sympathetic nervous system, which is that fight or flight. We're not safe. I need to handle everything, right? The way that I kind of described how I show up or used to show up before I did a lot of this trauma work. And then we have our dorsal vagus nerve, the connection in that part of our brain, the dorsal vagal dominance. And that's where we go into a state of helplessness, right? So there's a reason why when everything is finally over, so often that's when we fall apart, quote unquote, fall apart. I don't consider it falling apart. That's when we feel the feelings. What we need, right, in order to be able to get back into that ventral vagal dominance, that place of love and connection and support. And by the way, for some of y'all, that place feels scary. For some of us, we're so used to being in our sympathetic dominance or in our our dorsal vagal dominance that we feel a little weird. We feel distressed when we are in ventral vagal dominance because it feels scary. It feels unsafe. It feels unsafe, but it's actually safe. I know, kind of an oxymoron, right? So for a lot of us, we don't feel safe going into that ventral vagal state because we haven't had it modeled. We haven't seen people grieve from that state. We haven't seen people own that state and own that sadness. We haven't had that validated for ourselves. Maybe whenever we've loved and lost something in the past, and we tried to really go through that process of grief, which is innate inside of us, we had people tell us, nope, stop crying, don't show your emotions, just push through it. Or we had that modeled for us. We saw our family push through things. And so that's what we did, again, because survival. Maybe our family didn't have time to grieve because they legitimately needed to survive. So the three things that we really need in order to be able to move through grief, and that's like, we get to get ourselves back to a ventral vagal state. And the three ways to do that are, I'm going to tell you right now. So the first is supportive relationships, right? People who are there to just listen. People who know to ask you the question of, do you need witnessing? Like, do you just need me to listen? Do you want me to feel with you? Like, do you want me to get angry with you? Do you want me to get sad with you? Do you want me to get feel confused with you? And, or do you want some strategy? Do you want some coaching? Do you want, a handhold or a kick in the butt around what you need? Like, what do you need? And somebody who knows to ask that question, and somebody who knows how to actually give you what you're asking for. And you don't have to be perfect at this, by the way. If you're somebody who is in a supportive role and you're going to be supporting people who are going through grief, you do not have to be perfect at this. Yesterday, I had somebody come to me and say, hey, I can't get on a call because this thing is happening. And, we're all just kind of grieving. And I popped into nurse practitioner mode and was like, oh, hey, have you thought about trying this? Because this is something I used to do with my patients. And as I was falling asleep last night, I was like, I need to message them in the morning. And I messaged them and I was like, hey, I just noticed that I went into strategy mode without asking for consent, like if that was what you needed. And so I just want to apologize for that. And I want to check back in and see what you need. So you're allowed to do that, right? So finding supportive places where you can get back into ventral vagal state, where you can get your body, where you can feel safe, psychologically safe, right? And in my opinion, our TRIPS program is a place to do that. You get to learn and you get to process stuff as you go. So just throwing that out there. The other piece is we get to create relaxation in your body. I find it helpful to already be in a safe physical space, a place where I feel comfortable creating relaxation in my body before I try to do that, right? So that's why supportive relationship is important. It needs to be somebody that you feel comfortable showing all of your emotions to. And if there is nobody, then we need to make sure you're in a space where you're alone, right? There have been times where I choose to do my grief work when my husband has taken the kids somewhere else, where I know that I can fall on the floor and just sob and wail, and no one's going to hear me. It's not going to scare anyone. Sometimes I lead emotional release calls. And what I will tell people is go tell your humans, if there's humans in the house, that no matter what sounds they hear, you're fine, right? Because we need to create a safe space for you to be able to drop in and just really feel whatever it is that you're feeling. So relaxed body. We can use the 10-second protocol, which is what we teach at the Institute. And it's actually very simple. You squeeze everything in your body that feels safe to squeeze. So for me, that's my feet, that's my hands, that's my shoulders, that's my face, that's my butt and my abdominal muscles. And I just squeeze for 5 seconds. Then I relax for 5 seconds and try to just really let everything drop. And just noticing where any tension still lies. So right now I've got tension in my right hip. I can feel that my right shoulder is higher than my left shoulder. Those of you watching me on the camera can see this too. And just kind of breathing and moving and seeing what needs oxygen, what needs a stretch, what needs acknowledged. And then I do that 2 more times. Squeeze for 5 seconds, release for 5 seconds. And again, you squeeze whatever feels safe for you to squeeze. I do not hold my breath while I squeeze. I have a condition called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So if I held my breath during that, I would pass out. So I do not. Everyone gets to choose from a medical health perspective what feels safest for them to squeeze. I have some clients who just squeeze their butt muscles. I have some clients who just squeeze their fists or their face or their feet. And that's what feels safe for them. And you can also change it up every time that you do it. So that is a way to get into a relaxed body. For some of my clients too, I explain it during the tightening, we want to be a stick straight, hard spaghetti stick. And during the relaxation, just imagining your body dropping into a boiling pot of water and becoming like a wet noodle, just kind of feeling the movement around that. So that's one technique. Another technique for some people is exercise. So go exercise first and kind of work some of that adrenaline out of your body first. If you're watching this and you've ever cried after a really intense workout, it's probably because your body got relaxed. You worked a lot of those chemicals through, and that's a state of release. So exercise. A lot of people cry after sex or have some significant emotions after an orgasm or sexual release. And that's because it's a release. Your body is relaxed. And so those feelings are actually able to come up. So supportive relationship, supportive space, a relaxed body. And then the third thing is the ability to add language to what you've gone through. So something really fascinating happens when we experience trauma and grief. When we experience, especially the sudden loss of something or someone, our brain works differently when we experience trauma of that magnitude or loss of that magnitude. If we are not in a ventral vagal state when that happens, the languaging centers in our brain do not connect in the same way as when we are calm and relaxed and in that ventral vagal state as they do when we are in that sympathetic adrenaline pumping state or in that dorsal vagal state of like frozen, like I can't move, I'm helpless, I'm overwhelmed. The blood flow to that languaging part of our brain is different when our threat response is activated and when we are in that sympathetic dominant state or that dorsal vagal dominant state. A lot of people, when they go through very traumatic things and go through grief, they don't have the words. They don't have language for what they've experienced. And so getting into supportive relationships, supportive community, connection with others, creating that relaxed body state and getting that ventral vagal dominance turned back on, and then talking about what you're feeling, actually even adding sound, right? Allowing yourself to cry and be loud, right? Are there sounds that your body needs to make in order to get this out? What this does, being able to add a narrative to your experience, does something that when we go back to that Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief, and I said that there's a 6th stage, this is something that allows us to add meaning to what we've experienced. Because without the language, we don't know what it means. If we don't have words attached to what we've gone through, we don't know what our feelings and our emotions mean. So being able to come into that relaxed body and be like, oh, I like feel this in my chest. I feel this in like I'm noticing that I'm crying. And like, these are the images that are coming up for me. These are the things that I'm thinking of. These are the things that I'm feeling. All of that, being able to speak that out loud and have that be held by someone else, or even just out to the universe, that adds meaning to what we've gone through. That allows our brain to integrate the experience that has led to the grief into like the fabric of who we are. It allows us to add a new lens of how we look at the world based on what we've experienced. And if we don't do that, if we don't participate in that, the lesson is that grief and trauma is bad and scary, and we stay tensed up and we stay in that state of stuckness. So the goal is to allow grief to move you through. The goal of grief is to move you through, to process through the emotions and the feelings, and to add language, and to do it in a place that feels safe and with other humans who can hold you in that. And as somebody who has probably at this point worked with I was trying to think about this. I used to take care of 40 patients at a time, 30 to 40 patients at a time, weekly. For a decade, I've probably taken care of tens of thousands of people at this point. And also from a coaching perspective and from a reach perspective, I have had conversations or reached tens of thousands of people at this point. And what I have found to be so fascinating is that literally just sitting there and being in attunement and paying attention to somebody as they put words and as they allow themselves to feel what has happened to them is one of the most powerful things that you can do to support somebody through grief. Just listening to listen, to give them a place to feel all the things and to say the things that don't make sense. And I can't tell you how many times people will be talking and working through the narrative of what they've gone through. And they're like, well, maybe that's not exactly right. Or I don't even know if that makes sense. And I what I love to say is yes, it's right. And yes, it makes sense because that's what's coming up. It's all right. And it all makes sense, even when it doesn't. So this is how we integrate, right? We validate everything we are feeling and everything we are experiencing, which this is one of the hardest things for us to do because it's one of those things we're not taught. We are taught to invalidate ourselves, not validate ourselves. We understand that grief is a part of being a human, and we normalize the process of moving through the emotions and the sensations and the meaning around what loss is and how it affects us and how it changes how we're going to behave in the future. So that is all I have for you today. All I have, putting that in quotation marks. Invitation to come back and listen to this again if you're like, that was a lot. And I think the thing that I just want to end with is whatever you are feeling around what you have lost is valid. Whatever you are feeling around what you have lost is valid. However you deal with your grief, again, as long as you are not hurting or harming someone else, is valid. And if you find yourself hurting or harming yourself or someone else through your grief, the conversation I would invite you to consider is, what are you not letting yourself feel? Like, where are you invalidating yourself? Because what I find is that the people who end up hurting themselves and others through grief are the people who don't feel like it's safe to actually grieve. And so the trauma responses that they're going into around fighting or fleeing or avoiding or freezing are causing harm. And that is coming from this lack of safety. So what do you need in order to be able to feel safe? And that is a question that I think most of us aren't willing to ask people when we see them acting out towards themselves or others. And this is a truly trauma-informed response to when we see other people are hurting is, what do you need in order to be able to actually feel that pain? And how can I help you validate that the pain that you are experiencing is real? Because that is how we stop inflicting hurt and harm onto other people from a place of grief. So I think that's the trauma-informed lens added on this is, it's that saying of hurt people. When we see other people hurting themselves or hurting others, what that shows us is that there is some grief, there is some loss, there is some pain that has been invalidated and that gets to be recognized. So I will leave you all with that. Again, invitation to, if you're listening on the podcast, to head to the show notes to check out our trauma-informed psychologically safe certificate program. Like I said, we do a lot of this work in there. And I am going to drop that link for my Facebook Live humans in now, if this is something you'd like to consider joining. If you go to the website, that's either in the show notes or in the Facebook comments, you will notice that there is a place for some info sessions for trips that you can sign up for. There's 2 of them coming up in the next 2 weeks. If you're like, I think I want to do this and I'm not sure, or I have some questions, or I want to learn more about it, invitation to join us on those live info sessions, and you'll get the replay sent out after if you are interested. So love you all, sending you a warm, happy wish going into the new year together. And next week, we're going to be talking about resolutions and how you can set intentions for yourself moving into the new year. So I'm actually going to be doing a bonus live here in the Facebook group because I thought you guys might want me to share that. So I'm not sure when it's going to happen. I'm going to just do it whenever I have time to do it. So it might actually be this week. It might be next week. But for those of you on the podcast, listening to the podcast, it will be next Tuesday. So love you all. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Invitation to head to our show notes to check out the offers and connections we mentioned. Or you can just head straight over to institutefortrauma.com and hop in our email list so that you never miss any of the cool things that we're doing over at the Institute. Invitation to be well and to take care of yourself this week, and we'll see you next time.